Hey, what's up, everyone? This is Matt Myers, Salesforce CTA, and in today's video, I'm going to talk to you about the 10 proven things that you need to be doing in Salesforce to protect yourself from cyber attacks, and how to protect your users from brute force attacks, session hacking, and other types of attacks. I frequently like to talk about Salesforce, Salesforce architecture, and Salesforce cybersecurity best practices. It is my goal to help 1,000 Salesforce developers and architects become experts in Salesforce and advance their careers in the Salesforce ecosystem. The first best practice that you need to be aware of is you need to enable multi-factor authentication in Salesforce. But what is multi-factor authentication exactly? Multi-factor authentication is when you're authenticating to a system and that system uses more than one factor to verify your identity. With typically multi-factor authentication, there are two different factors. The first thing is what you know, and the second is what you have. What you know is typically something like your username and password, and what you have is something typically like a security key, something like a YubiKey, or potentially your cell phone with something like Salesforce Authenticator turned on it. Both of these are something that you actually have in your possession that you can use to authenticate your identity. So that this is very important, because what this means is even if an attacker has managed to crack someone's username and password, they will not have something that's in your possession, like your cell phone with Authenticator app on it, or like the YubiKey here that you stick into your computer. This is something that is very hard to crack, especially unless someone has actually stolen your computer and stolen these devices that typically you have on your person. So that makes your authentication mechanisms with multi-factor much more secure, making it extremely hard for an attacker to crack one of your users and log into Salesforce without proper authentication. The next two best practices we're going to talk about are very similar. The first one is locking your domain to the session where it first originated. What this means is when a user logs into Salesforce, they're logging in from a specific domain. When they log in, that domain is tied to their session. So if, let's say, someone tries to hijack their session and then logs in or tries to access Salesforce with their session that they have established but from a different domain, then Salesforce is going to block all of the requests that they have made to Salesforce from that secondary domain. The next best practice, which is similar as well, is locking session to the IP address from which they originated. This is very similar to the domain, but instead of locking from the domain, it's actually locking from the IP address. So on the same principle, if an attacker has hijacked someone's session and they're trying to log into Salesforce using their session, but from a different IP address, then Salesforce will also block all access to that other user from that IP address, since the session was locked and bound to that initial IP address. This also ties into another best practice, which is making sure that all of your users are logging into Salesforce from their VPN. If you enable this setting to tie the IP address to originating IP, then if you're using VPN settings, then your users will be coming from a specific IP address on your VPN, and therefore locking it from that IVPN. And then for adding another layer of security, you can also enable IP restrictions from the user profile or by permission set to restrict users to only be able to allow to log in from specific IP addresses. So with both of these settings, you have now doubly protected your users from getting their sessions hacked, because one, you're only allowing users to log in from a certain specific IP address range. And secondly, once they have logged into Salesforce from one of those IP addresses, no one can actually log in from a different IP address using that same user session. There is one thing that's to note about the originating session from the IP address setting, is that sometimes if you use certain service providers that are a large service provider that use multiple servers to deliver a service to you, they sometimes will have multiple different IP addresses that those systems can log in from. So sometimes if you enable this feature, could cause your service providers to not be able to connect to Salesforce, because the IP has now been restricted, and when one of their other servers from a secondary IP try to connect to Salesforce, that request is being blocked. So sometimes you are not able to enable this feature because of this, but if you are able to, I highly recommend enabling this feature because it does add a great deal of protection into Salesforce. The next feature that we're going to talk about is enabling the HTTP only attribute in Salesforce. There is a special type of attack that attackers will do, or a very common attack that attackers a lot of do, will be attacking users with client-side scripts. This can be either from sites like a phishing site, or even on your Salesforce, maybe someone downloaded an open source script, and then there's some client-side scripts that are attacking your users' browsers, trying to gain information and gain access to that user session. Or maybe it's just a plugin the user installed that are running scripts on the browser, sniffing at their sessions and trying to get their session information. A lot of times, session information is stored in browsers in what is called a cookie. A cookie is basically encrypted settings within your browser that store typically things like credential and session information that could be used to log into another site. What the HTTP only attribute does is it blocks any type of client-side scripts from gaining access to the Salesforce cookie that would allow another attacker to be able to use your user session to log into Salesforce. It is very important that you use this HTTP only attribute setting, because this adds a whole nother layer of protection onto your user, so client-side scripts cannot be executed and take over your user sessions. The next two best practices are something that have been around for a very long time and are generally accepted, are very good practices in the industry. And this comes down to your password policies for your users logging into Salesforce. There are two very good practices that you should be following when it comes to password policies. The first one comes to setting the maximum number of attempts that someone can make before a user has been locked out. What this means is if someone's trying to crack, let's say, a user's password by entering the password in multiple times over and over again, after a certain number of attempts, they should actually be locked out of Salesforce. So that way that user cannot log into Salesforce because an active attack is being performed trying to gain access to that user's account. And typically, usually you want to set it to 3 attempts. You want to lock out that user's account for at least 15 minutes. So that means after 3 invalid passwords have been set, or have been entered incorrectly, that user will not be able to log into Salesforce for another 15 minutes, provided that no other attempts have been made during that 15 minutes. If someone attempts to make another attempt within that 15-minute window, then the user gets locked out for 15 minutes again. So this is, as you can imagine, a really strong technique to ensure that someone is not trying to do what's called a brute force attack at guessing someone's password. And the second part of setting strong password policies comes to the password itself. What you want to make sure is you do in Salesforce is ensure that you force your users so they are setting a strong password. This means enforcing a certain specific length of the password, which usually you want to do at least 10 characters or more, and making sure that your users have to do not only lowercase, but lowercase, uppercase, numbers, and a special character when entering the password. And then making sure that a certain number of passwords are remembered in the password history. That way a user cannot reuse the same passwords over and over again. I recommend that you save at least 8, if not more, of the previous passwords, ensuring that their user is at least rotating out their passwords that could be set within that time. The last piece is you want to make sure that you're forcing your users to change their passwords at least every 90 days. So with remembering 8 passwords in every 90 days, that means it's going to be more than a year before they will be back to the original password if you have your users using the same passwords over and over again. So our last 2 best practices here that I want to talk about are more around auditing your security in Salesforce. The first one I want to bring up to your attention is something called health check. Health check is a rather newish functionality or feature in Salesforce that allows you to set up policies in Salesforce and run them against your org to validate that certain security settings are set in Salesforce. And then it outputs a health score showing how in compliance you are with your policies. Health check comes with a base set of policies that Salesforce sets for you, but it allows you to set your own custom policies as well. These types of policies actually cover some of the things that I just pointed out here previously in this video, in addition to a number of other types of settings that can be set in Salesforce. So you really should be setting and reviewing health check on a routine basis to ensure that you have set up the appropriate policies and that your org is in compliance with your organization security settings. The last best practice is just a general best practice that is pretty much true for any system out there, which is to routinely audit Salesforce and your other systems for any kind of security issues. So health check is one of those things that will help with the auditing, but there also are many other things that you should be doing, such as, for example, checking the Salesforce set of audit logs and audit trail to see what kind of changes people have been doing in Salesforce, or even using something such as Salesforce Shield to do deeper auditing to see what kind of records your users are accessing, and also just validating that any users that you have had that have not been logged in a certain amount of time have been disabled in Salesforce, and you don't have any users that are no longer working your company in Salesforce. There are a number of other types of things that you should be auditing in Salesforce, but that covers the main ones that you really should be looking out for. You should talk to your company's cybersecurity department to see what kind of things that you should be auditing, so that way you stay in compliant with their policies and keep yourself protected in Salesforce. If you really enjoyed the best practice that I shared with today and would like to learn a little bit more, take a look below in the description down below. There's a link where you can download a document that goes more in deeper detail into all of these best practices. I really appreciate you taking the time to watch this video today. If you like this content, please go ahead and hit that subscribe button, and don't forget to click that bell so you're notified next time I post another video. Please let me know in the below if any comments you would like to leave, anything else you would like to learn. Happy to post that. Thank you, and hope you have a wonderful day.